Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending presentation session 3, track B of the RDAP Summit 2020. Just some housekeeping and logistics to go over before we kick off. This is a Zoom webinar, so attendees are muted and your cameras are turned off. But to ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. It's right next to the chat button. This session will run from 1:15 to 2:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 15 minutes past the next hour in your viewing location. And the last 15 minutes of this session will be reserved for Q&A. Please indicate the presenter or presenters you would like to direct your question to when typing in the Q&A box. Just helps us keep everything clean and flowing easily. And we'll save all questions until the end. After the session, please feel free to drop additional questions or continue the conversation in the chat window in Hoover. Just a note on our code of conduct, the RDAP Summit organizers are committed to providing an environment where all attendees can participate fully in the program and activities without fear of harassment or discriminatory behavior of any kind. There is a code of conduct helper available during this session, Read, who you can identify with the COC helper text next to their name. You may direct message them in Hoover if you need assistance, and they can also give you the code of conduct email address or link to the incident report form if necessary. So we're going to go ahead and kick off because we're running just a couple minutes behind schedule. So let's start off. Please welcome Abigail Gobin, Kristen Briney, and Heather Coates to the screen. And take it away, guys.
Let me get slides shared here. All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our talk on data governance for RDAP 2022. I'm Kristen Briney. I'm the biology librarian at Caltech. I'm joined today by Abigail Gobin, who's data librarian and policy advisor at University of Illinois, Chicago, and Heather Coates, data librarian and data steward at IUPUI. So we're going to be doing a couple things today. We're going to be talking about data governance. We're going to go into a little bit about what data governance is and why you should probably want to start thinking about it at your institution. We're going to be showing you a couple different models of data governance because it's not all the same. So we're going to be sharing models at our own institutions. And we're going to wrap up by talking about where the gaps are and some of the problems and issues you're likely to encounter when trying to strengthen or create data governance at your own institutions. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Abigail to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Kristen. So we wanted to start with giving you an idea of some of the reasons why you might need data governance in higher ed. What are some of the things that you might want to address, to deal with? And these certainly do not begin to cover everything that is related to data governance, but to give you an idea and to connect them back a little bit to other kind of data management activities that are already very familiar for you. So the idea of long-term stewardship has a data management role. It also has a data governance role, enabling collaboration, whether that's within units on campus or if it is partners within a consortium, working with government offices, however it is that you are collaborating. Identifying partners, we know that's always a huge part of research data management, and minimizing risk. And we've actually got this in a couple of different ways. That idea of minimizing risk, whether that's unauthorized access, a data breach, or whether it's something like protecting IP and licensure. Both of these are very high concerns for our institutions these days: security, privacy, but also protecting the intellectual property of the faculty and also of the university. And then there is more compliance rates, again, similar to what our data management work is, but also more broadly in that this isn't only necessarily about research data. That's where we tend to start, but there's a lot of other pieces that go into that as well, a lot of other kinds of data. And I will turn this next to Heather.
So data governance generally tends to be described and operationalized at the level of individual organizations. But governing data requires that we balance the institutional priorities that we have along with those of funders, investigators, and others across any given research community. So governing research data is truly a community effort, as I think we've heard other folks speak to a lot in the past couple of days. And so where you have maybe encountered obstacles or friction when you're trying to help researchers share data, some of those might be in part due to data governance decisions, gaps in policies or processes. And this can introduce some interesting things that we'll talk about in a bit, that the boundaries of research data governance are often unclear, in part because data governance can be many things. And when we do the daily work of governing research data, we begin to see how different perspectives, values, priorities, and assumptions play out. Next slide, please. So we wanted to give you a sense of where each of us is positioned in data governance at our institutions. So I'll start us off by speaking about where I'm at. In 2017, I was appointed the first data steward for research data at Indiana University, and I was able to step into a mature data governance program that had started in 1991, which is kind of crazy to think about. But it had very much been built around institutional data, what we might think of as administrative or operational data. And they really hadn't grappled with the wonderful world of dynamic research data. So our data governance program sits primarily within IT, with strong connections to our information policy and information security offices, as well as sort of reporting up to executive leadership, think vice president level.
I'll go next. There we go. So UIC is a little less mature than what Heather has. We started what we kind of consider our data governance work in 2011, where we have, and it is driven by IT, it's called the IT governance or IT leadership committees, depending on when you joined. And we're still pending having a specific data governance committee. It is still an ongoing thing that we're hoping to have in the next year or two. But we have committees that are on research, they're on education, they're on infrastructure, there's a couple others. So really targeted groups that are thinking about the kinds of information and also the kind of resources that we need. This all reports up to an oversight committee that has direct report to our CIO. And our CIO does tend to kind of pop into meetings periodically. These are monthly meetings. He usually pops in at least once a semester. What's nice is this brings together both people from IT, from security and privacy, from those offices, and faculty representatives across the university. So we see from every college, and that provides a really wide variety of voices to come to the table. Kristen?
So if we have mature and less mature, Caltech would be described as immature when it comes to data governance. We really started in 2019 when the Office of the Provost told the library that we need to get a handle on the ownership of research information. We're very proprietary about intellectual property on campus, and there was nothing being done about research data. So I led a group within the library and IT to come up with some recommendations, one of which was to create a research data policy and to start thinking about data governance. And so we have not yet pushed on that policy. We've taken a back seat to pushing on the NIH data management and sharing policy to make sure we're in compliance with that, because right now we're still trying to build those relationships and connections across campus. So this is all very nebulous, and we're in that very unformed founding state of, we know we kind of need to do this, but we still are not connected in an integrated way. So as you can see, there are multiple different ways to accomplish data governance, and it's going to look different in every campus. But there are some common gaps that you are likely to run across if you're trying to strengthen data governance on your campus. We're going to talk about 3, but there are several more. So we're going to be going over like the problem of who's responsible, dominance of IT perspective, and differentiating governance by data domains. Research data is different than other types of data. But there are other things that you're likely to encounter, such as rapidly changing external policies and pressures. For me, it's the NIH policy coming up. We got to respond to that. Local bureaucracy or lack thereof, What do you have in terms of local training and documentation to correspond with the governance? And similarly with what local policy exists to reinforce all of this? There are issues emerging from the intersections of research, compliance, and IT because everybody has a different stake in data governance. And then there's many unknowns about what exactly don't we know and what are we likely to encounter as we try to build governance structures at our institutions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who is responsible. And this is a particular challenge at Caltech. And it relates to the bureaucracy or lack of bureaucracy point, because we don't have bureaucracy at Caltech. I mean, if you take Caltech, it's like, and bureaucracy are like oil and water. If you shake them in a jar, they don't mix. It just doesn't happen here. So when we're trying to build governance, one of the key problems is that we have people kind of doing stuff, but who is actually leading governance? Somebody needs to take some ownership of governance and to put some authority and to put some direction behind this. So if it's not clear who's responsible, then you don't really have a lot of drive to build those necessary connections to build governance. So we have some will on our campus in the library, me personally interested in this in the university library and willing to step up and take a larger leadership role, but we can't do this alone. We need to have other people with different stakes, such as IRB and the Office of Research and IT coming together, but we definitely need somebody who is going to be responsible for this, and people are going to take ownership of their own pieces of this data governance challenge.
So I'm going to talk about this from the dominance of IT. And as I described, the committees and the data governance that's currently happening came out of IT and is still very much housed there at this point. And this creates a couple of different potential conflicts because from an IT perspective, they are internal. They are providing a lot of those central tools that we use on a regular basis. But what I have found is they often tend to approach things from a perspective of risk management. That is their job. They are there to protect the university, help us to get our things done. And this can be in conflict to some of the goals of researchers or the needs of researchers, whether that is a compliance need, whether that is a collaboration need. So all those things that we talked about at the beginning. You see some potential conflict between a desire for risk management, a desire for sharing, especially as we move towards open sharing and open data and things like that. How do we navigate that? Thank you, Ashley. And then there's also a lot of different perspective and understanding from the resources. IT tends to come at things, one way, and there is an IT solution. That is the answer. There is an IT solution. And researchers are not necessarily on board with that solution. They are frequently, they just want or need or are used to, depending if they work somewhere else, to something different. And so I think it is important that we think about making sure other voices are at the table. And it's one of the reasons I'm really active with this group. I'm on the research committee to make sure that we are capturing all of those different voices, not just from an IT perspective. Next slide.
And I'm going to yes and what Kristen and Abigail have already said, but speak to some of the issues that I've encountered over the last 5 years. So over that time, it's become fairly obvious to me that the requirements for differentiating research data governance from administrative or operational data governance are absolutely show up in the day-to-day work that we do in governing research data. So at a high level, it's kind of hard to talk about. So I'm going to get a little bit more concrete about what I'm seeing at IU. So first, one of the most common things, and I think we talk about this at every RDAP in many ways, communication's hard. So having a shared understanding of key terms like access and data sharing is crucial for good communication, because the ways in which IT talks about that is not the same as the policy office, is not the same as data librarians, is not the same as funders. And we're seeing that with the NIH policy. Second, existing processes for ensuring the security of institutional data on what we call third-party systems often focus on areas of risk that aren't super relevant to researchers, or they assume that researchers have knowledge that they don't. So researchers are not InfoSec professionals, right? And so we need to speak to them and ask for information in a way that makes sense to them. Third, the timing of many of our existing data governance processes doesn't exactly align with the timing of research projects, all the way from proposal through the closeout of a project and after. So researchers are often encountering these processes during startup when the clock for their funding's already begun and there's massive frustration. We're piloting some strategies to reach them further upstream and ideally during the project development phase. So finally, as Abigail already spoke to, there are emerging issues in research that result from overlapping and conflicting regulatory requirements. And what we've seen is that these issues require a high-touch, time-intensive approach to accurately identify and resolve them. But the good news is that oftentimes once we have the right people in the room, we can solve it in a 15 or 30-minute meeting. So that has been a really fascinating development. So that is it for me. I think we are almost at time. We have identified a few next steps. If you are interested or you're running into these barriers in your own work, you learn about data governance at your institution. Connect with someone new, begin a conversation, ask questions. And that is where most of our work, I believe, has started. And these relationships are really what are crucial for having data governance go anywhere at an institution. So thank you all for your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Abigail, Kirsten, and Heather. So now we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Natasha Johnson and Megan Sapp-Nielsen, who will tell us more about the impact of institutional data on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Take it away.
Natasha, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm trying to share. Give me a moment. All right. Does everyone see that? Okay.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Natasha Johnson, and I'm here with my colleague, Megan Sapp-Nielsen. And today we're going to talk about the impact of academic capitalism on belongingness, institutional data's impact on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our colleague, Catherine Envy, is not able to join us today. Okay, sorry. All right, so I am an associate professor of library science here at Purdue Libraries and School of Information Studies. Megan is associate department head, also here at Purdue Libraries and School of Information Studies. And Catherine Envy is one of our intercultural learning specialists and a longtime collaborator of mine who works in essentially our institutional data department, institutional data analysis and assessment. And we got the three gals together and we had a conversation and it led to this work. I'm also related to this work is I'm 50% appointed to be a provost fellow in the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. So what is institutional data? It is the administrative and transactional data collected by the university, right? And it also is the clinical, administrative, and research and instructional activities. It informs those things. So what does it look like? It may look like SAT data. It may look like income. It may look like location. It looks like lots of different things. I was a part of an equity task force led by our board of trustees. And one of the things they wanted to collect was institutional data about some of the things pertaining to Black and Brown students, faculty, and staff at the university, but there wasn't a lot of it, right? And it wasn't necessarily representative of what perhaps Black and Brown people, students, faculty, and staff may think represents them, right? And another definition is data in any form, location, or unit that is substantive and relevant to the planning, managing, operating, documenting, staffing, or auditing of one or more major administrative units or multiple organizational units of the university. So again, that could be race, right? And whether a particular institution, how that is defined. Here at my university, we recently allowed people or enable people to select more than one thing and not put them in one box, right? But it can also be gender, it could be age, it could be nationality, citizenship, parental education, right? That's where some of that legacy data comes in, or first gen data comes in, the income or the total family contributions, right? Sometimes that we see in some of the FAFSA reports. SAT and ACT scores, high school grades and activities, right? These are things that come in through the transcript sometimes, and sometimes through the application processes. Admission status, right? So accepted, are you interested? Are you in the pipeline? Lots of different ways to look at that. Always in progress towards degree. So that would include the retention and graduation, if you're on track, not on track, majors, minors, classes taken, internships, clinical rotation, status, et cetera, right? And then careers. So this was an interesting one. We had a conversation via email earlier today about careers, not realizing that even the Career Center keeps and holds data about alumni, right? And the internships, we mentioned internships already, but what does that look like? And sometimes that speaks to the marketability of the university or marketability of a program, right? And that's a part of the institutional data that's often collected on students. So how and when is this data collected, right? And it's a mixture. It's a whole thing, right, on how this data is collected, right? So some of it is publicly available data, right? Some of it is self-reported data, right? So then you get into the issues of, is that adequate? Is that right? Did they tell the truth, et cetera? And beginning as early as kindergarten, right? Realizing that sometimes if a family applies for a certain type of aid, if they're free or reduced lunch, that information is tracked and people will know that for a long time, whether or not that, and then that includes the family income, that includes family size. So lots of these things start very early, way before college, right? And then there's some of it's aggregated, a lot of it's aggregated, but what does that say about the collection practices and if it's even the appropriate data? So what we have here, Megan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure.
This picture, so I'm going to let her describe it.
So people think about the data that the university collects, but a lot of universities are contracting with third-party agencies to gather data on the students that interact with their websites to collect third-party data. So that's going to include any place that they go on the internet after they have gone to the university's website or concurrently with tracking to the website. So let's say that a student goes to the website and that student then goes out to Facebook or to YouTube or to TikTok, and they start tracking their profiles through these third-party agencies, and they get around FERPA by listing these agencies as agents of the university. So even though the students don't know that these third parties are tracking their data through the web in this way, the university is able to get away from disclosing that the students are doing this by just saying, oh, well, they're contracted to the university, so clearly they're higher education professionals. But they're not. They're third-party agencies who are contractors. So not only are there what we think of as personal characteristic data, but then there's all of this what we would call publicly available social networking data that is also grandfathered in under FERPA to create these profiles as well.
Thank you. So we propose a model, or we're thinking about what does it look like to get asset-based data and deficit-based data, right, as it pertains to our students. So I use the example, and Megan used the examples, strength-driven data, right? What are these people, what are these students, faculty, staff able to contribute to the university culture and climate versus what do they need of us? Do they need scholarships? Do they need intervention? Do they need remediation? All these things that are sometimes needs-driven. Then we have opportunity-focused, right? So what does it look like for the university, the institution to be an opportunity, right? Or for us to have the opportunity to have this person as a part of our campus community versus this person being a problem, right? We think sometimes with languages. Is this a problem that needs to be solved? Do they need to get into the mode, or is this an opportunity for us to expand the linguistic skills of everyone on the campus? So there's a lot of different ways to look at the languages as an opportunity versus a problem that needs to be fixed. Internally focused, right? Are we looking at what will make this person tick and succeed? Or are we looking at how they can contribute to what we're trying to do, right? And oftentimes, in the conversation about EDI, sometimes it's, externally focused could be like, we need one more hash mark, right, in this space versus, how can we contribute to this person being their best person, right? So, and what is present that we can build upon? What are the existing skills? What are the existing attributes for a group of people or a particular person versus what's missing that we must go find, right? And that's two different lenses in which to look at people and the strengths that they bring to an institution, right? But then also being open to something new versus rehashing the same mistakes, the same issues, the same conversations that we've been having for generations at this point, right? So what does it look like to look at different communities, different groups of people in new ways, right? Which would see these people, these groups of people as assets, right? So exploring conversations with academic capitalism and belongingness. And what does that look like within a data context? So academic capitalism, it blurs the boundaries between for-profit and not-for-profit sectors, a basic change in academic practices, changes that prioritize revenue generation rather than unfettered expansion of knowledge and policy negotiation and strategic and academic decision-making, right? So as Megan said, what does it look like for these lines to be blurred? Right, where we're strange bedfellows with, billion-dollar companies who gather data about us, essentially, even as faculty and staff, they're gathering data about us and our students. So what does it look like for those lines to be blurred, right? And to have a different focus. We like to think of ourselves as missions driven, but there's another mission that's running alongside our existing missions. And then this is a great definition of belonging. When we're looking at definitions of belonging, we have lots of different ones. We have kind of like the germane definition, but this is a newer definition in 2019. Sense of belonging refers to students' perceived social support on campus, a feeling or sensation of connectedness, and the experience of mattering and feeling cared about, accepted, respected, valued by, and important to the campus community and others on campus, such as faculty, staff, and peers, right? So how can I put this on the slide together because how can these two things coexist? Right? How can you have a place that has boundaries blurred, right? A toss up between for-profit and not-profit, but also having people feel accepted, valued, and respected. Like how do both of those things, or both of these very squishy concepts, coexist, right? And this is its own set of challenges. So critiques and things to think about with our current practices, right? Sometimes information is power. I mean, we're all information professionals in this space, and we know that information is power, but sometimes it leads to data silos, right? One of the things that we're dealing with right now at our institution is our Black and Brown students are tired of being over-surveyed, right? And why is that the case? Because there's data silos. We have groups of people gathering information about a particular group of people within that certain context, and they're not sharing it outside. Right? So it's created data silos, and there is power in that particular group of people who have access, but that another group needs that same access and doesn't have access because they're not part of the silo. So it's like this cycle sometimes that we can't get out of. Another critique is a focus on outputs rather than learning outcomes. Imagine that, right? Where we're looking at yield rates and not necessarily the quality of the education, or did they get what they came for? Right? Lots of people attend college for different reasons. So did they get what they came for? Or did we give them what we intended to in our different disciplines? Focus on the individual and not the community, right? So what does it look like to have a solo, whether that's a solo LGBTQ student or a solo Black or Brown person? And how do you meet the needs and how do they feel like they belong in that particular context? Right? And that's something that we wrestle with as an institution. Deficit models of portraying student experiences, which we've already talked about that. Predictive modeling and algorithms of oppression. My cute little question mark right there. Predictive modeling and algorithm of oppression. What does that look like? When we're trying to predict something that is inherently does not even measure their sense of belonging. Right? And if the model is working, what does it really say about the belonging? Or is that not even a consideration? Right? What are we actually trying to predict? So lots of questions into this topic. And then also data feminism, how we examine power, how we think about binaries and hierarchies, considering the context of any institution, any group of people, right? Or anything that, wherever the data comes and where the data will go and live, what are we thinking about in terms of the context of those things? And also making emotional labor visible, right? For any of these groups of people and how we collect data about them and how we share that data. So some of our informing constructs as we embark on these emerging research interests for us is critical methodologies, right? So what can the Indigenous data practices tell us about some of the data practices that we could use to understand and foster belonging in our campus, and also autoethnographies, right? So there's lots of different critical methodologies, but autoethnographies particularly because that gets into some of the qualitative data that we sometimes overlook when we're doing these data analyses, right? Sometimes we just want hard, fast numbers, something that you can crunch, right? But, you know, to get into the uniqueness of the stories and how we can foster the belonging with individuals and groups, we're going to have to dig into some qualitative analysis. We already talked about data feminism. I think Bell Hook's book, Belonging, A Culture of Place, talks about how all these things intersect and can coexist at the same time and may or may not foster belonging. And also some newer concepts, campus ecology, which is the study of the system of three components: the inhabitants of a campus, the setting of a campus, and the activities and behaviors of that campus. And what is that? And how does that look in the context of data, institutional data specifically? And then white institutional presence, right? So we're talking about white ascendancy, monoculturalism, white estrangement, and white blindness also within this institution. So what does that look like when we're also trying to foster belonging? So there's lots of tough questions and things to dig into in looking at the institutional practices that are informing our work.
So what we are working towards is thinking, instead of a quantitative-based methodology for institutional data focused on asset-based data, we are looking at a qualitative-based institutional data when we're talking about assets based on, such as belongingness. And what we're talking about is the theory of concentric circles, which actually came out of public health. This is a model. This is actually an image from a public health document that is looking at physical activity and recovery after surgery. But this gives you an idea of what that model might look like. It starts from the individual, and we're at time, so I'm not going to be able to go ahead and finish up, but we're happy to take questions about what we're thinking in the future with this project.
Sorry about that, but thank you so much, Nastasha and Megan. So our final presenter for this session is Lindsay Guyton. So go ahead and let Lindsay take it away.
Hello, I'm gonna leave my camera off just because I'm having some internet connectivity issues, and it tends to be better when my camera is off. So hello, I am presenting on making libraries for everyone, building a reproducible workflow to assess classification. My name is Lindsay Guyton, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the data services librarian at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and I am in my first year as a data services librarian. I listed my life goal on the slide as ending systemic racism in libraries. That is not a SMART goal, so it's not going on my performance plan for the year, but it's kind of the thing that gets me out of bed and to work in the mornings. Oh, sorry. In the presentation today, I'm going to talk about what the frictionless tools are, as well as the fellowship. And then we're going to talk about the data that I'm using in my fellowship. I've been using MARC records. And then I'm going to show you what I've done using the frictionless tools and go over some takeaways and future ideas. So Frictionless says it better than I can on their website. So I'll give everybody a second to read this quote. It's essentially a suite of open source tools that can be used for data management and support reproducible research. The fellowship is a program designed to train early career researchers to become champions of the frictionless data tools. It uses a cohort model, and it is in its third cohort. I'm one of 6 researchers from around the world. There's 1 person in North America, 2 in Europe, 2 in Africa, and 1 in Asia. Additionally, we all have different disciplines of research. 4 are in the hard sciences, and then there are 2 of us that are social science researchers. We're all learning to use the tools as they relate to our specific research domain. And then we're also all learning how to advocate for open science. So the first thing that I needed to do once I was accepted into the fellowship was figure out what kind of data I wanted to use with these tools. Now, libraries create a ton of data, just like everything else. There's circulation data, there is reference transaction data, there's data from classes about the effectiveness of them, etc. But going back to my life goals, I really want to look at libraries as a system of oppression. So I want to look at the system, which is the library catalog, and I want to look at the back end of it, which is the MARC records. If you've never seen a MARC record before, this is a very zoomed in view of a MARC record. You'll notice the left-hand column has numbers. Those are just the fields. Each one has a 2-digit code. Sometimes they're null. This is null. And this is like 0 and then null. And then they have a variety of information in the sort of second column. There's no common delimiter between these pieces of information. You'll see here in the 300 field, A ends with a colon, while B ends with a semicolon, etc. So it's definitely not tabular data is kind of what I'm getting at. But I know I want to look at MARC records. This is what one looks like. What part of the MARC record specifically do I want to look for systemic oppression in? So I sort of considered this question and thought the 520 field would be a good place to look. The 520 field is sort of the back of the book summary. 505 field might be a good place to look. It is the formatted contents note, which is cataloger speak for table of contents, although it's not always a table of contents. And then, of course, the Library of Congress subject headings. Library of Congress subject headings are a controlled vocabulary, but they are problematic in nature. The other thing that I want to point out is that sometimes a book won't have a 520. And in many cases, they'll have duplicated fields. So for example, this particular text has 4 Library of Congress subject headings. That gets problematic when we start looking at tabular data. So being that I'm a data librarian with an access background, I thought I should probably also ask some catalogers where they might look. So I went to a resource that I think is really cool and I wanted to share with all of you. It's called, it's a Facebook group called Troublesome Catalogers and Magical Metadata Fairies. A lot of critical catalogers or just really catalogers go here and they have conversations about authority records and other things that come up in cataloging when they don't have a direct answer. I really love lurking and reading about the challenges that they have. But I went here and I posed my question of, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. Where would you look? And they did come back with the same answer I had come up with, which is the 505 field and the Library of Congress subject headings. All right, so I'm ready to find my data and I'm building a reproducible workflow. So I figure I should get some data that's already readily available. So I went to the HathiTrust Digital Library, hoping to download some MARC records from there. They do have MARC records that you can download. Unfortunately, the collections that I looked at didn't have specific MARC fields that I wanted, so I had to go elsewhere. So I went to my own catalog and I did a keyword search for the word basketball, and I got, I think, 1,224 records as a result. So I asked a colleague, like, hey, can you download the MARC records for a keyword search of basketball for me? And the answer was yes, but it's going to take all weekend. So it took all weekend. And eventually I had my data, which we'll look at in a minute. I wanted to go over why I picked basketball. If you've never done any research in critical cataloging, you might not know how Library of Congress subject headings work. They are structured hierarchically. And so basketball players is a broad term that has narrower terms nested underneath it, such as basketball players with disabilities or women basketball players. So having basketball players hierarchically above women and players with disabilities sort of predisposes users to imagine a typical basketball player as an able-bodied man. It also sort of suggests that those are, higher than women basketball players, etc. If you wanted to learn more about this concept, this link should take you to the Library of Congress linked data service for subject headings. It will show you specifically basketballs as well as the narrower and broader terms. And if you wanted to learn more about what I'm talking about this hierarchical problematic nature, Amanda Ross wrote a really quick blog. It should take less than 5 minutes to read, and she has some really good examples there. All right, so this brings me to the frictionless tools. There are two tools that I've learned so far. One is the data package creator, and the other is called Good Tables. What the data package creator does is it takes a tabular data file, so CSV file, and it creates a metadata schema that is a JSON file. And these two things together are a data package. Good Tables then takes those same two files and it validates the data, but it also does continuous validation. So if you are working on as a part of a research team where multiple people are updating data continuously, it's an ongoing research project. As soon as somebody enters their new data and uploads it, Good Tables will validate their data entry, which if you're doing a lot of data will save you a lot of time in the end. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I got an export of 4 files. I got a MARC file, a text file, a JSON file, and then a MARC edit file. Unfortunately for me, none of these formats are tabular data, so I can't just upload them to the frictionless tools, to the data package creator. I could probably use the TXT file to create a CSV if I had the same delimiter between information, but because of the way MARC records work, that wasn't going to be something that I could do. So I kind of searched to the end of the internet and I found a solution. There is a program called MARC Edit. It was conceived in 1999 and the website was last updated in 2013. I was able to download this software and tell it which fields I wanted, and it created a CSV file for me, which saved me a ton of time. So that was super great. This is what my data looks like in tabular format. The 100A is the author. This is the title. This is the subtitle. We already talked about the back of the book description. You'll notice that these first couple entries didn't have a back of the book blurb, but they do have a table of contents. And then here we see the Library of Congress subject headings. So what I did was I took this data file, the CSV, and I uploaded it to the data package creator. Here's an image of the data package creator. You can see I've put my file in. And then what it does is it identifies, these are all of the columns that you have in your data package. And you need to tell us for your metadata schema, what's the title, the description, and what data type should I expect to see in each of these columns. So you go through and you do that, and then you download your data package, which is the data file that you just uploaded, and a JSON file that has your metadata schema in a machine readable format. The next tool that I've learned is called Good Tables. And I took the JSON file with the metadata schema that I've already created. I keep pointing at my notes screen instead of the presenter screen, so I'm really sorry if you aren't seeing where my mouse is. I took my JSON file that I just created, as well as my MARC CSV file, and I upload them into Good Tables. And what it does is it creates a permalink that does that continuous validation. You can take the permalink and you can put it into a tool like GitHub. so that anytime you are uploading new data, it will automatically validate for you. And then it tells me a couple of things. I've got one warning. It says, you've hit our 1,000 row limit. So I had 1,200 records. So it does have a 1,000 row limit. However, because it's an open source tool, you could take the code from the Frictionless website and put it on your own server in order to be able to do more than 1,000 rows. And then it says, other than that, your table is valid, which, given that I'm using data that was already machine readable, makes sense. If you're a researcher in the sciences, you're probably going to see more human error, and this is going to direct you to all of those errors, and it's going to give you advice on how to fix it in case you waited until the end to validate your data. Okay, so the takeaways that I have, first, these tools are really, really awesome. They're super useful for tabular data management, which is the majority of what I do as a data librarian. They're great for reproducible research, and they have a shallow learning curve. Future ideas for me personally, I am really interested in machine learning, so I have a little data science learners group where we meet once a month, and we've talked about like, what can we do with this? And we are talking about doing, I call it like a find and replace algorithm that will look for outdated Library of Congress subject headings in collections and use machine learning to replace them. So an example would be Illegal Aliens was updated in November 2021. It was replaced with undocumented immigrants and non-citizen. So theoretically, yes, most of those records have been updated, but some of them kind of slipped through the cracks. So the algorithm would go find the ones that slipped through the cracks and would automatically update them so that catalogers don't have to do that. Or what I would really love to do, and I have no idea if it would actually be possible, but the end goal is creating a predictive model that would anticipate when new Library of Congress subject headings might become problematic based on subject headings that have been updated because they became problematic. Whoever created the term illegal aliens didn't know that it was going to become problematic. So if we could train an algorithm to figure that out, that would be cool, but I don't know if it would be possible. Yes, and here is my contact info, as well as a link to the blog that talks more about the frictionless data for reproducible research fellowship.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And thanks to our presenters. It was wonderful to hear from you all. Thanks for our audience for participating. We look forward to seeing you again in our next session, which is presentation session 4 at the top of the hour. And for the next 40 minutes, we'll be holding a poster session 1. So we encourage you to head over there and explore the highlighted posters and chat with the authors. And there will be new Zoom links. So we're going to close out this Zoom. Thank you very much. Everyone have a great afternoon, and we'll see you later.